What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors walks onto a daytime talk show expecting a normal conversation and instead gets ambushed with accusations, disrespect, and personal attacks that cross every line imaginable? In just 36 seconds of one single comment, Joy Behar managed to ignite a firestorm that would end with Samuel L. Jackson storming off the set of The View in front of millions of viewers, leaving the entire panel speechless and the studio audience in absolute shock. The morning started like any other episode. The studio lights were bright, the audience was buzzing with excitement, and Samuel L. Jackson walked onto the View stage with his trademark cool confidence. He was there to promote his latest film, dressed sharp in a black suit, flashing that famous smile as the crowd erupted in applause. Whoopi Goldberg welcomed him warmly, giving him a hug before he took his seat at the table. Sunny Hostin smiled and waved. Sarah Haynes looked thrilled to have him there. Even Joy Behar seemed pleasant at first, greeting him with a handshake. But that pleasantness wouldn't last long. The conversation began innocently enough. Whoopi asked Samuel about his new movie, and he dove into talking about the project with genuine enthusiasm. He spoke about the intense preparation, the stunts, and working with the director. The audience was engaged, laughing at his stories, and everything seemed to be going perfectly. Sarah asked him about his approach to choosing roles, and Samuel gave a thoughtful answer about looking for characters that challenge him and stories that matter. Then Joy Behar decided to steer the conversation in a completely different direction. "You know, Samuel," Joy interrupted as he was mid-sentence talking to Sarah, "I've been wanting to ask you something. You've made a career playing these tough guy roles, these action heroes. But don't you think that contributes to toxic masculinity in our culture?" The question landed like a bomb. The smile faded slightly from Samuel's face. Whoopi's eyes widened. Sunny shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The audience fell quiet, sensing the sudden tension that had filled the room. Samuel paused for a moment, clearly taken aback by the confrontational tone. He maintained his composure and responded calmly. "Well, Joy, I think there's a difference between playing strong characters and promoting toxic behavior. The roles I choose are about courage, protecting others, standing up for what's right. That's not toxic, that's heroic." Joy wasn't satisfied with that answer. She leaned forward, her voice taking on an edge. "But you have to admit that Hollywood has a problem with glorifying violence, especially through black male actors. Don't you feel some responsibility for that?" The accusation hung in the air. Samuel's jaw tightened, but he kept his cool. "I think you're confusing representation with glorification. Black men have every right to be action stars, heroes, and complex characters just like everyone else. What I do on screen is entertainment, and it's storytelling." Whoopi tried to step in, clearly sensing this was going south fast. "I think what Samuel is saying makes a lot of sense. These are fictional characters telling important stories." But Joy wasn't backing down. She actually cut Whoopi off. "I'm not finished," she said sharply, turning back to Samuel. "I just think someone with your platform should be more careful about the image you're putting out there. Young people look up to you." Samuel sat back in his chair, his expression hardening. "So, you're saying I should, what, exactly? Stop playing roles that show black men as strong? Stop being in action movies? What are you actually suggesting here, Joy?" "I'm suggesting," Joy said, her voice rising, "that maybe you should think about the consequences of your choices. You're not exactly setting a great example." The audience gasped. Sarah's mouth fell open. Sunny looked at Joy like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Whoopi put her hand up and said, "Joy, come on now." But Samuel held up his hand to Whoopi, signaling he wanted to respond himself. His voice was measured but firm. "Let me get this straight. You invited me here to promote my film, but instead you're sitting here lecturing me about my career choices? You're questioning my integrity and telling me I'm not setting a good example?" Joy doubled down. "I'm asking legitimate questions that I think our audience wants answered. If you can't handle a little criticism, maybe you shouldn't be doing interviews." That line crossed a boundary. Samuel's eyes narrowed. "Criticism is fine. What you're doing is disrespectful. You don't get to invite someone onto your show and then attack their character and their life's work." The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every second of this increasingly hostile exchange. The audience was completely silent now, watching this unfold like a car crash in slow motion. Joy scoffed and waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, please, you're being dramatic. I'm just asking questions." "Dramatic?" Samuel's voice raised slightly, still controlled but clearly frustrated. You just accused me of promoting toxic masculinity and being a bad example. That's not asking questions, that's making accusations. Sunny finally spoke up, her voice careful. Maybe we should talk about the actual movie. Samuel, tell us about your character. Samuel appreciated the attempt to redirect, giving Sunny a nod. I'd love to, Sunny. My character is actually a father who's trying to reconnect with his daughter while also stopping a conspiracy. It's really about family and redemption. But Joy couldn't let it go. She interrupted again. See, even that. A father who abandons his family but then gets to be the hero? That's such a typical male fantasy narrative. Whoopi's voice came out sharp. Joy, that's enough. Joy turned to Whoopi. No, Whoopi, I'm allowed to have an opinion here. This is my show too. It's our show, Whoopi corrected her, and you're being rude to our guest. Joy's face flushed red. She turned back to Samuel with visible irritation. I'm sorry if you think I'm being rude, but someone needs to hold Hollywood accountable. Samuel leaned forward, his voice deadly calm. And you think you're the person to do that? You, who's never walked a day in my shoes, who's never experienced what I've experienced, who's never had to fight for the kinds of roles and opportunities I've had to fight for. You're going to sit there and lecture me about accountability? The audience murmured in agreement. Several people clapped. Joy looked flustered, not used to someone pushing back so directly. I have every right to ask these questions, Joy insisted, her voice getting louder. That's what we do on this show. We have discussions. Discussions require respect. Samuel shot back. What you're doing is grandstanding. You're using me to make whatever point you want to make, and you don't actually care about my answers. Sarah tried to intervene. Maybe we can all take a breath here and just reset the conversation. But Joy was on a roll now, her ego clearly bruised by Samuel's refusal to back down. You know what your problem is? She said, pointing at Samuel. You can't handle a strong woman questioning you. That's the real issue here. The room went dead silent. Even Joy seemed to realize she'd gone too far, but the words were already out there. Samuel stared at her for a long moment. Then he laughed, but it was a bitter laugh, one without humor. So now we're doing that? Now you're going to try to make this about gender? That's your play? I'm just calling it like I see it, Joy said defensively. No, Samuel said, standing up from his chair. What you're doing is hiding behind your position on this show to be disrespectful and condescending. You invited me here under false pretenses, ambushed me with loaded questions, ignored my answers, and now you're trying to paint me as the problem. Whoopi stood up too. Samuel, please, sit down. Joy, apologize right now. Joy crossed her arms. I'm not apologizing for asking tough questions. These aren't tough questions, Samuel said, his voice rising with real anger now. These are attacks. There's a difference, and you know it. The audience was on Samuel's side. That much was clear. People were nodding. Some were even calling out support for him. Joy looked around, seemingly surprised that the room wasn't backing her up. Sunny spoke up, her voice diplomatic but firm. Joy, I think you should apologize. This has gotten out of hand. Joy looked at Sunny like she'd been betrayed. Are you serious right now? You're all going to gang up on me? Nobody's ganging up on you, Whoopi said tiredly. You're wrong, and you need to admit it. Joy's face was bright red now, her voice shaking with indignation. I'm not wrong. I asked legitimate questions about his career and the messages his movies send. If he can't handle that, that's his problem, not mine. Samuel shook his head slowly, a look of disgust crossing his face. You know what? I'm done here. I don't need this. I came here in good faith, and you've made it clear that you have no interest in an actual conversation. He started to remove his microphone. The producers in the background looked panicked, frantically trying to figure out what to do. This was live television, and one of the biggest movie stars in the world was about to walk off their set. Joy's voice turned mocking. Oh, so you're just going to run away? That's mature. That was the final straw. Samuel stopped what he was doing and turned to face Joy directly. His voice was ice cold. Let me tell you something. I've been in this industry for decades. I've worked with some of the greatest directors, actors, and writers in the world. I've earned my place. I've earned my respect. And I've earned my reputation. I don't need validation from someone who sits behind a desk and tears people down for a living. You want to talk about setting a good example? Look in the mirror. The audience erupted in applause. People were cheering, standing up, showing their support for Samuel. Joy looked shocked, her mouth opening and closing, but no words coming out. Whoopi grabbed Samuel's arm gently. Samuel, please don't go. Joy, say you're sorry right now or leave the table yourself. Joy stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. I'm not apologizing for doing my job. Your job is to interview guests, not ambush them, Sarah said quietly, but everyone heard it. Joy glared at Sarah, then at Sunny, then at Whoopi. She was outnumbered and she knew it. Fine, she spat out. If that's how you all feel, then maybe I should leave. Nobody said you should leave, Whoopi said, exasperated. We said you should apologize. But Joy was too proud, too stubborn, too convinced of her own righteousness. She grabbed her notes and started to walk off the set herself. A producer rushed over to stop her, whispering urgently in her ear. She shook her head and kept walking, disappearing backstage. The studio was in chaos. The audience didn't know whether to applaud or sit in stunned silence, so they did a bit of both. Samuel stood there, his microphone still clipped to his jacket, looking at Whoopi with an expression that said everything. I'm sorry about this, Whoopi said to him, and she genuinely meant it. This is not how we do things here. Samuel's face softened slightly when he looked at Whoopi. I know. I respect you, Whoopi. I respect what you've built. But I can't sit here and be disrespected like that. I just can't. I understand, Whoopi said sadly. I'm sorry you had to deal with that. Sunny stood up and walked over to Samuel. For what it's worth, I thought your answers were perfect. You handled that with more grace than most people would have. Sarah nodded in agreement. You were completely right to stand up for yourself. Samuel gave them a small smile. I appreciate that. I really do. But I think it's best if I go. He looked out at the audience and raised his hand in a wave. Thank you all for being here. I'm sorry you had to witness that. The audience gave him a standing ovation. People were shouting words of encouragement, telling him they supported him, that he was right. It was clear who the room sided with. Samuel finished removing his microphone and handed it to a nearby crew member. He shook hands with Whoopi, Sunny, and Sarah, giving each of them a brief hug. Then, with his head held high and his dignity intact, he walked off the view stage. Whoopi turned to the cameras, her face showing the strain of what had just happened. We're going to take a quick break, she said, her voice tired. We'll be right back. The cameras cut away, but the damage was done. In the span of just a few minutes, what should have been a routine promotional interview had exploded into a full-blown confrontation that ended with the guests walking out and one of the hosts storming off the set. Backstage, Samuel was immediately surrounded by apologetic producers, his own team, and staffers who couldn't believe what had just happened. His publicist was already on the phone, doing damage control, though it was clear from the audience reaction that Samuel wasn't the one who needed his reputation managed. In another part of the backstage area, Joy was in her dressing room, refusing to talk to anyone. Producers knocked on her door, trying to convince her to come back, to apologize, to salvage what was left of the show. But she wouldn't budge. She was convinced she'd done nothing wrong, that she'd simply asked hard questions and that Samuel had overreacted. Back on set, Whoopi, Sunny, and Sarah sat at the table during the commercial break, talking in hushed, urgent tones. The audience could hear bits and pieces. Whoopi kept shaking her head, saying, I can't believe she did that. Sunny looked genuinely upset, and Sarah seemed to be processing the shock of what had just unfolded. When the show came back from commercial, Joy's chair sat empty. Whoopi addressed the audience and the viewers at home with characteristic directness. As you can see, we're down 2 people. Samuel L. Jackson has left the building, and Joy is taking a moment backstage. What you just witnessed was unfortunate, and it's not representative of the show we try to bring you every day. Sunny added, Samuel Jackson is a consummate professional and a gentleman. He handled a very difficult situation with incredible restraint. Sarah nodded. We hope he knows that we have nothing but respect for him and his body of work. The 3 remaining hosts tried to continue with the show, moving on to other segments, but the energy was completely off. The audience was distracted, still buzzing about what they'd witnessed. Social media was already exploding with clips and commentary. Everyone who'd been watching had an opinion, and the overwhelming majority sided with Samuel. Behind the scenes, phone calls were being made to network executives. PR teams were scrambling. Lawyers were reviewing footage to figure out what could and couldn't be said publicly. It was a full-scale crisis, the kind that makes careers and breaks reputations. Samuel, meanwhile, left the building through a side entrance, avoiding the inevitable crowd of paparazzi that would gather at the main exit. His team hustled him into a waiting car, and as they pulled away from the studio, he looked out the window with an expression of someone who'd just been through an unnecessary battle. He'd come to promote a movie. He'd come to have a conversation. He'd come in good faith, expecting the basic level of respect that any guest should receive. Instead, he'd been ambushed, accused, and disrespected on live television in front of millions of people. And he'd handled it exactly right by refusing to sit there and take it, by standing up for himself, by calling out the behavior for what it was, and by walking away when it became clear that there was no productive conversation to be had. The incident sparked immediate and intense debate. People argued about interview tactics, about respect, about ego, about accountability. But one thing was crystal clear to everyone who watched it unfold. Samuel L. Jackson had been the reasonable one, the professional one, the one who'd tried to engage in good faith until it became impossible. And Joy Behar had let her ego and her need to score points override basic courtesy and respect. As the car drove through the city streets, Samuel's phone was blowing up with messages of support from friends, colleagues, and fellow actors who'd seen what happened. Text after text came through, all saying variations of the same thing. Good for you. You were right. She was out of line. You handled that perfectly. He responded to a few, thanking them for their support, but mostly he just sat there, still processing what had happened. It wasn't the first time he dealt with a difficult interview, and it probably wouldn't be the last. But this one felt different because of how unnecessary it had been, how avoidable the whole confrontation was, how easily it could have gone a completely different way if Joy had just approached the conversation with a fraction of the respect he'd shown her. Back at the studio, the remaining segments of The View limped to a finish. Whoopi, Sonny, and Sarah did their best to maintain some semblance of normalcy, but it was like trying to continue a party after the house had caught fire. Everyone knew what the story of the day was, and it had nothing to do with any of the other topics they covered. When the show finally ended, the three hosts sat at the table for a moment after the cameras stopped rolling, just looking at each other. No one said anything at first. What was there to say? They'd all witnessed the same train wreck, all been part of the same disaster. Finally, Whoopi spoke. That should never have happened. Sonny and Sarah both nodded in agreement. What do we do now? Sarah asked. We figure out how to make sure it never happens again, Whoopi said firmly. The aftermath would unfold over the following hours and days, but in that moment, sitting at that table, they all knew that something fundamental had shifted. A line had been crossed, a boundary had been violated, and there would be consequences. Joy eventually emerged from her dressing room, but by then the studio was mostly empty. The audience had gone home, the crew was packing up, her fellow hosts had left without seeking her out. She walked through the quiet hallways of the building, still convinced she'd been in the right, still believing she'd just been doing her job. Samuel L. Jackson's movie would go on to be a massive success. His reputation, already stellar, somehow emerged from the incident even stronger. People respected how he'd handled himself, how he'd stood his ground without losing his cool, how he'd called out disrespect while maintaining his own dignity. The View would have to reckon with what had happened on their stage that day. Questions would be asked about editorial oversight, about the dynamic between the hosts, about how guests should be treated, and what constitutes acceptable discourse. But all of that was still to come. In the immediate aftermath, as Samuel's car merged into traffic and the studio lights dimmed and the last crew members locked up for the day, the only thing that mattered was what everyone who'd witnessed it already knew. Samuel L. Jackson had walked onto that stage as a respected actor and guest. He'd been treated poorly, disrespected, and put in an impossible position. And he'd walked off that stage with his dignity intact and his head held high, having shown everyone watching exactly how to respond when someone crosses the line. It had taken just 36 seconds for Joy Behar to make the comment that started it all, but it had taken years of experience, wisdom, and self-respect for Samuel L. Jackson to handle it the way he did. That was the real story. Not that an interview went badly, but that one person knew when to walk away, knew their worth, and refused to compromise their dignity for anyone. The studio was empty now, dark and quiet. The audience was gone. The hosts had left. The crew had packed up and headed home. But the impact of what had happened there that day would echo far beyond those walls, far beyond that moment, reminding everyone who heard about it that respect is not optional, that dignity matters, and that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is simply walk away.